Okay, wonderful. And now we will put up the presentation that Jonas has prepared, and Jonas, the floor is yours.
Okay. Hi to everyone. My name is Jonas. It is also my first webinar, so please let me know if I do something wrong. I hope you can all hear me very well. Um, I have to switch on the camera first. Okay. Okay. So again, hi to everyone. I
Jonas,
have
we
been
cannot
work.
see you yet. You have to
Okay.
click
Okay.
start.
Yes. Can you see me now? Yes. Okay. So sorry for that. As I've just told you, it's my first webinar experience as well. um, yeah, my name is Jonas Schubert. I have been working as a child rights officer for Terre des Hommes Germany since 2010. I'm currently leading Terre des Hommes' international campaign for the child's right to a healthy environment. To give you just one brief example of my work, in 2016, I had the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child organize its Day of General Discussion on Children's Rights and the Environment. This is an expert conference, or this is a format, the format of an expert conference that aims at enhancing understanding of emerging topics in the context of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And in 2016, the committee chose the topic of children's rights and the environment after Terre des Hommes had submitted a proposal to do so. If you don't mind, I will now switch off the camera because I might feel a bit uncomfortable going through my presentation if I'm being watched on the camera. I hope that's okay for you. 1 second, please. Okay, so let's start then. To start with, I just want to briefly set out the aims of this webinar again. It basically it aims to enhance understanding of the relationship between children's rights and the environment, a very new topic, and wants to provide an overview of the latest developments in this emerging field of international children's rights law. It's a very dynamic field. You might observe in a minute, as you might observe in a minute. While this webinar is not focused on practice, it will also try to outline how children's rights may be applied to both environmental policy and laws. For example, children's rights can be used to inform environmental impact assessments and other instruments of environmental governments. It can be used, a child rights approach can be used to inform environmental education, urban planning processes, environmental health regulation, etc. Um, bef before I give some, okay. But now I think we will have our first question. So this question is basically asking you what's your prior understanding of the relationship between children's rights and the environment, because I mean it's a very new topic and not everybody might be familiar with it. Oh, wow. Okay. If I'm correct, we are still waiting for some people to answer, right? Okay, so I get notice that I should move on. The result of the first question seems to be very promising, I think. There's at least one person with expert knowledge on the latest developments, so please listen. You can listen critically and correct me if I'm wrong on some of the issues. But now I want to start. Okay. Before I give some practical examples of environmental harm to children, I would like to provide some basic facts about this relationship. It is kind of a background knowledge we all should have. I think it is a very urgent issue. Already millions of children suffer from environmental harm worldwide, and this includes interference with a wide range of their rights, including the right to health, development, culture, food, water, etc. When we talk about environmental harm, we often think about pollution and climate change, but other types of environmental degradation, such as the destruction of ecosystems, exhaustion of natural resources, or lack of access to nature, are relevant too in this respect. The topic has a strong temporal and geographical dimension. In a temporal sense, the following two aspects are important to keep in mind. First, there are certain environmental factors that impact the child prior to conception, and these impacts can continue into adulthood and intergenerationally. Disability and disease associated with exposure to toxics and pollution of parents prior to having children, or the children themselves, may not manifest themselves for years or even decades. Moreover, in some cases, scientific understanding is yet to permit a full evaluation of the risks resulting from environmental harm. So this is one aspect to keep in mind in terms of timing. A second aspect is that certain hazardous substances from human activity persist in water, food, air, and soil for a long time, and thereby expose generations of children to environmental risk factors. In a minute, I will present an illustrative example of that. With the environment increasingly under pressure, there's a risk of rising impacts and abrupt change and irreparable damage, impacting the quality of life of all future generations. So that's the second aspect. In a geographical sense, the topic ranges from localized harm that concerns a specific number of children through, for example, exposure at contaminated industrial sites or mining sites, for example, to transboundary harm like climate change or the disposal of waste in other countries that often involve business activities. A rights approach to the environment focuses on issues related to discrimination and vulnerability in particular. Among the factors that determine children's vulnerability to environmental risks, age, biology, and behavior are salient, I think. The physiological features that distinguish children from adults include the need for more food and water per unit of body weight, the immaturity of the blood-brain barrier and nervous system, a different rate of organ systems growth, a faster breathing and higher heart rate, and so on. If a child is exposed to environmental toxicants during a period of rapid growth and development, even at low levels, this may put the child at a greater risk of developing disease. Children are also impacted in ways in which adults are not. This includes, for example, involuntary exposures during fetal development and breastfeeding, child-specific behaviors, for example, outdoor activity when small children especially take objects into their mouth, etc. And movement in different exposure zones. I mean, children just walk nearer to the ground. In addition, children are at increased risk from environmental hazards because they cannot control their exposures, especially in the most vulnerable periods of their life, when they fully depend on the parents' or caregivers' awareness, knowledge, and capacity to protect them. But besides these types of vulnerability, children also suffer from the fact that they are the least empowered to exercise their rights to information, their rights to free expression or assembly, and the right to be heard as well as to access justice when their rights have been violated. Marginalized groups of children, for example, working children or poor children living in degraded environments, bear a disproportionate share of the inaction on the environment, which strongly implicates the principle of non-discrimination. I would argue that children's differential or different risks compared to adult and their specific discrimination as a social group are not always duly considered in policy relevant assessments on the environment, standard setting, and the identification of priority concerns related to the environment. Environmental laws, if you look at them, typically describe children as a vulnerable group, but not as rights holders. While vulnerability is understood in a very narrow sense as a biological condition, but often excludes other important social, cultural, and structural aspects. I will now move to the. I'm still on that slide. What you see here is an infographic we used for the 2016 Day of General Discussion on Children's Rights and the Environment. If I may remind you, this is the conference that TEDism helped organize last year. And the infographic picks up an estimation by the World Health Organization of the environmental burden of disease borne by children. Of the roughly 6 million deaths of children under 5 each year, 26%, or as the infographic says, 1.7 million are attributable to the environment. I think this is a very big number, and it is only the tip of the iceberg, as it were. Because the number does not account number does not account for those children dying after the age of 5. And additionally, there's a silent pandemic, as some experts say, of disabilities associated with exposure to toxics and pollution during childhood, many of which, as I said before, will not manifest themselves for years or decades. So I had just mentioned some numbers related to the death of children related to the environment, and now would like to provide some more on human rights and the environment more generally, because the magazine The Lancet has just published a very good report on pollution and health that estimates that 9 million people die from pollution every year alone. It is the largest environmental cause of disease and premature death in the world today, and accounts for 3 times more death than AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis combined. So I think that's a very significant fact. It is also 15 times more than the death from all wars and other forms of violence we currently experience. In developing countries, more than 1 death in 4 is related to pollution. Furthermore, this report states that while traditional forms of pollution, such as household air pollution, for example, from cooking stoves, and water pollution are slowly declining, other forms such as ambient air pollution, like the air pollution we experience in daily traffic, or chemical pollution and soil pollution, that is the forms of pollution produced by industry, mining, agriculture, electricity generation, etc., are on the rise. The estimate of the 9 million people who die from environmental conditions every year only includes well-established pollution-disease relationships, whereas emerging effects of known pollutants or new and emerging pollutants whose effects on human health are only beginning to be recognized and are not yet quantified are excluded. So the number of deaths from pollution is likely to be much higher than 9 million. In the following, I will present a few illustrative examples of local and global environmental issues that pose a threat to children's rights. What you see here is an example from the local level. children's rights violations resulting from lead mining in the fourth largest city of Zambia, in Kabwe. Here you can see children, on the picture you can see children playing football, and in the background you see some tailing points from that still exist in this area. In Kabwe, the main source of pollution is an old lead mine that you see here on the picture. It operated for almost 100 years, largely unregulated, and it was closed down in 1994. Uncovered tailing dumps, as the ones you can see here in the picture, pose a significant threat because of the continued risk of contamination due to wind-carried dust. The most significant pathway for lead to enter the body in Kabwe is ingestion or inhalation of lead-contaminated soil. So you can easily see here that children are playing football barefoot, and it's quite easy for them to ingest or inhale soil dust. The Kabwe mine, just to explain why I provide the example, ranks among the world's top toxic threats. It is sometimes, or Kabwe is sometimes called Africa's most toxic city. Terre des Hommes, as an organization, has been documenting the impact of the situation on children's rights and supported pilot projects to clean up homes and play areas since 2014. Terre des Hommes has also submitted a shadow report to the Committee on the Rights of the Child when Zambia was under review in 2016 to report on the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child in that particular country. In 2014, we also commissioned an environmental health assessment, which showed that lead pollution poses a threat to basically all of the estimated 100,000 children under 14 who live in Kabwe. We took over 300 soil examples. You can see that on the next slide. So yeah, we took over 300 soil samples across affected communities. You see the mining site in the middle of the picture, and different communities that surround this mining site. And those most affected are the darker colors. The average of lead in soil that we detected was 2,626 parts per million. For your interest, the WHO, the World Health Organization standard for areas where children play or frequent is set at 400 parts per million. So I don't know, it's 12 or 13 times that standard. In some play areas where we took soil samples, we found high concentration of lead in soil, up to 15,000 parts per million. It is scientifically proven that at a level of roughly 400 parts per million of lead in soil, this is the WHO standard, the uptake of lead by children should result in blood lead levels, because lead enters the blood and then the brain, etc., and the bones of children. That at 400 parts per million, the standard, lead levels should be below 10 microgram per deciliter. And this is the threshold for concern used to protect children. These are very scientific numbers, and I stop here. But I think it's important to understand the problems in Kabwe. Many experts say that there is no safe dose of lead in blood because it is extremely poisonous, and that the threshold should at least be further lowered to 5 microgram per deciliter, because that already leads to lead exposure that can result in injury to the brain and nervous system of children and are irreversible. Our assessment found a mean of almost 50 microgram per deciliter, so 10 times the current standard, across 196 blood samples we took of children under 10 years old. All samples were above the threshold of concern. And I think this is very serious. 26% of the samples we took were found to be above the detection level of the equipment we used, which was 65 microgram per deciliter. So probably the numbers were much higher. The World Bank funded a government-led remediation program in Kabwe from 2003 to 2011. but it was based on, it was not very sustainable, and it was based on a cost-benefit approach, not a human rights approach. Just for you to explain, only a limited number of children projected to be affected were tested for blood, for lead in blood, and an even smaller number of children thought to be heavily affected was effectively treated. And among those children who were treated, children were discharged from the program, healthcare program, once they reached a level of 25 microgram per deciliter. So that's still far above the WHO threshold of concern. Our analysis of the situation in Cabo found the Zambian government to be in breach of its duty to protect children and their rights to life, health, development, and play. And we also criticized the lack of access to information and education. Now I move on and will provide a bit more info on two global issues, two global environmental issues that are of particular relevance: air pollution and climate change. Here again, I forgot to move on to the next slide, which shows you the different blood lead level samples we took, and the impact this has on children's cognitive development below in the chart below, where you can see that the IQ levels drop with every point in lead in blood. Okay, but now I move on to the next slide, which is on air pollution. Or better, the slides 7 to 12 are all on air pollution and their impact on children's health. Air pollution is responsible for the death of approximately 600,000 children under 5 every year, and it threatens the lives and futures of millions of more children every day. Almost 1 in 7 of the world's children, 300 million, live in areas with the most toxic levels of outdoor air pollution. These are areas that are 6 or more times higher than international guidelines, and around 2 billion children live in areas where outdoor air pollution caused by factors, for example, like vehicle emissions, heavy use of fossil fuels, dust and burning of waste, exceeds minimum air quality guidelines. So these numbers are quite high. Slide 7, the one that you see right now, is a regional breakdown of death from both outdoor and indoor air pollution. It shows that basically children everywhere suffer from this type of environmental harm. Now slide 8 shows that air pollution is a huge problem in many Eastern European cities too. I've included this map because I think most of you are from Eastern Europe. Slide 9 shows that air pollution is a major contributing factor to pneumonia, the biggest killer of children. In the chart below, you see that asthma and other health impacts that result from air pollution are projected to increase over the next decades. I think this is also important to stress. And slides 9 and 10, but I will go back to 9. Slide 9 and 10 further explain that vulnerability to air pollution takes different forms during the various stages of childhood, which you can see here right now. And what I find important as well is that the effects that air pollution has on children are cumulative and heavily impact health and social and economic aspects of life, not only throughout childhood, but also in adulthood. So this is a very brief introduction to the impact of air pollution on children's right to health and development and life, for example. Now, slides 12 to 15 depict the potential impact that climate change has on children's rights. I think there's a common misconception that children will live with the consequences of climate change in the future, when the reality is that children are dealing with consequences of climate change as we speak. From malnutrition and the spread of vector and waterborne diseases to physical and psychological trauma, children are affected in different ways and more profoundly than adults with respect to climate change. They are also one of the largest groups to be affected, as many of the countries most vulnerable to climate change have a high proportion of children. Recent data, and now I come to the slides, suggest that over 500 million children live in areas with extremely high risk of flooding, as you can see here. 150 million children are at high or extremely high risk from tropical cyclones, and almost 160 million children are exposed to high or extremely high drought severity. Now I have to switch back and forth. Slide 13 and slide 15 further show, and I think that's also important to say, that most children at risk from climate change suffer additional disadvantages that worsen their vulnerability. You can see it here on this slide. Slide 16 then illustrates that children are not simply victims of climate change. The organization Our Children's Trust, which also presented, which was also present at the last year's Day of General Discussion, has pursued legal actions on behalf of a group of children and youth against US government agencies and 50 federal states over insufficient action to secure a stable climate for all generations and to protect natural resources. In November 2016, so last year, a judge at the US District Court ruled over the objections of government and energy industry lawyers that the suit could proceed, granting standing to youth aged between 9 and 20 because their rights to life, liberty, and property were at stake. So I think this is quite relevant because in many cases it is very difficult for children and youth and for people more generally to access justice in relation to the environment, because it is very difficult to prove causal relationships between impact and effect, and sometimes also because impacts will be only felt in the future. But in this case, a court allowed the suit to go on. I would now like to draw attention to what might be called an emerging issue of children's rights and the environment. So I think air pollution and climate change are now very established environment or established issues when it comes to recognition that they impact on children's rights and human rights more generally. But there are also some other issues where recognition is still not achieved, and this year is one of the issues where it's still not very clear whether it should be recognized as a human right or a children's right. But I want to explain what I mean here by nature deficit order. Children find it increasingly difficult to get access to spaces where they can come into contact with nature. Global developments such as growing urbanization, expanding human populations, land and resource consumption, or deforestation and biodiversity loss all contribute to a worldwide decline, not only in the quantity but also in the quality of children's direct sensory experience of the natural world. The absence of nature in a child's life is associated with a range of health issues, including the rise of obesity, attention disorders, and depression. Damage to the environment can also negatively impact children's emotional health and sense of belonging and identity. For example, when traditional livelihoods are lost because the environment is destroyed. And as some people say, this type of environmental harm can even result in what might be called a nature deficit order. The following example, and we'll read it out, of this condition was shared by a participant in the 2016 Day of General Discussion on Children's Rights and the Environment. After the nuclear accident in Japan, children living in Fukushima were forbidden to touch any mud, bugs or plants or eat fruits for a couple of years. Kindergartens that still operated in the area stopped farming and other outside learning experiences, and teachers were discouraged from planting activities. Several kindergartens made efforts to provide indoor activities emulating natural settings. Others, on the other hand, bused children to areas with low contamination where they could take part in outdoor activities. However, even after being encouraged, these children would refuse to touch the soil with their hands, since up to that point in their lives, they had been prohibited from handling ground soil. Children are now scared of insects, etc., or other animals. They grow up, as the participant in the conference said, without the learning excitements of exploring nature. We come now to the next question, which I would like to ask you, which is whether you think that the lack of access to nature for children it should in fact be framed as a human right for children or not. What's your opinion on that? Perhaps just to explain this again, it could be said that lack of access to nature for various reasons could violate children's right to development, play, and health, because nature is an underlying determinant of these rights. On the other hand, it could be said like there are already a lot of children's rights, the ones included in the Child Rights Convention, and we should not further expand this list. Children's rights are not a wish list, so to say, and not everything that is desirable is a human right. Okay, but here, see, well, very, very clear. So you're with me and think that this is, in fact, a child right that should be protected. It is one that is not very clearly contained in the Child Rights Convention. Okay, but then I move on to the next slide. This is one of the final example of an environmental issue that I want to mention here before I move on to the more legal and policy aspects. As you can see on slide 19, worldwide there are people who are being persecuted, imprisoned, and even killed because they stand up for human rights and the environment. Environmental activists, including children and youth, we heard some examples at the conference last year, are one of the most threatened groups of human rights defenders, as you can see here. So up to now in 2017, at least 158 environmental defenders have been killed. And you can also see the countries where most of them were killed, and you can also see the sectors they have been working on, and you can finally you can see the hotspots on the world map. If you like to learn more about this topic, please take a look at the website of Global Witness. This is an organization that publishes a yearly report on the state of environmental rights defenders. Very interesting, I think. Now I move on to the next slide, which is then more, or I think like now I would like to speak a bit more about the legal relevance of this topic, having given an overview of environmental issues at the local and global level. To start with, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the instrument that contains the globally recognized rights of children, is in fact one of the very few human rights treaties, perhaps the only one, that refers explicitly to the environment. It was a latecomer to international human rights law because it was only drafted in the 1980s. And back then, awareness of environment problems had already increased, so there's a reason why there are references in the convention to the environment. The two existing references are related to the right to health in Article 24 of the convention and to the aims of education in Article 29. In reality, however, many more provisions included in the convention are related to the environment. Children's ability to enjoy their rights to life, development, and health, as we have seen before, but also their rights to culture and identity, play and leisure, right to have a family, food and water, an adequate standard of living, freedom from exploitation, for example, for working children, and freedom from all forms of violence, education and housing. All these rights depend on our living in an environment that is healthy and sustainable for children. But I would say, and I would argue that the converse is also true, that the exercise of human rights is necessary to the enjoyment of a healthy environment. By that I mean children's ability to have their views heard, to be able to express themselves and to assemble, to obtain child-friendly information, and to be able to access justice on environment issues. So this is also a requirement for them to be able to exercise their rights to a healthy environment. In my view, if the CRC was being drafted again today, I'm pretty sure a full-fledged right to a healthy environment would be included. Let's move on to slide 21, which includes a few developments at UN level. Recent developments. Because in recent years, much progress has been made to enhance understanding of the relationship between human rights and the environment more generally, and to improve protection of those particularly affected, including children. For example, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, and I have mentioned this before, decided to dedicate its 2016 Day of General Discussion to the issue of children's rights and the environment. Days of General Discussion have the aim to explore the implications of emerging issues and their implications for the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Just for you to know, over 250 experts took part in the conference, including children and youth from different world regions. The committee also issued an outcome report, which I would recommend all those of you interested in the topic to read, because it summarizes the current debate in a very condensed manner. Several UN experts and agencies have produced reports on children's rights in relation to the environment in 2016 and 2017. For example, there's one report on children's rights and toxics and pollution, and another one on climate change and children's rights. Next March, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, John Knox, will submit a comprehensive report on children's rights and the environment to the UN Human Rights Council. I think this is very important because it will provide a systematic overview of relevant international law and policy in this area. Lastly, with regard to recent developments, I would like to draw your attention to the guiding principles on human rights and the environment that John Knox is currently drafting. These principles are the result basically of all the work he has engaged in since he started his mandate in 2011. The guidelines spell out the obligations that states have in relation to human rights and the environment. I will briefly summarize them here because I believe that in future they will provide a basis for law and policy on the human environment. So now I briefly summarize. The principles include a very general obligation, first, to prevent, reduce, and remedy environmental harm that interferes with human rights. So, very general obligation to protect people and children against environmental harm. It also includes a general obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights and actions to protect the environment. So when states take action actually to protect the environment, children's rights should also be considered. And thirdly, a general obligation to prohibit discrimination and ensure equal protection against discrimination related to the environment. So no one should be discriminated when it comes to environmental issues. The principles further include procedural obligations. For example, states have a duty to assess environmental impacts that may interfere with human rights. They also have to provide public access to environmental information, for example. But the principles also include substantive obligations. Substantive obligations include the duty to establish a normative framework on the environment, For example, substantive standards related to air or water quality, the climate, biodiversity, pollution, etc., that are consistent with relevant international environmental standards. They should also put in place an effective legal and institutional mechanisms to regulate activities of private and public actors to prevent environment or remedy and reduce environmental harm. Finally, and I think this is most important for children's rights, or for the relationship between children's rights and the environment, the guidelines spell out the heightened obligations that states have in relation to those who are most vulnerable to environmental harm, including children. The heightened obligations, first of all, include a duty to identify those most vulnerable to different types of harm. So you could say that children in general are very vulnerable, so all states should at least identify the ways in which they are being harmed by the environment. But then again, there are also children who are particularly vulnerable to environmental harm, including working children, indigenous children, etc. Secondly, states are under a duty to protect those who they identify, to protect those children who they identify as vulnerable, taking into account their different specific needs, capacities, rights, and risks. Including by assessing environmental impacts of proposed actions on them, by facilitating their access to environmental information, including information on the specific effects of environmental harm on them, but also by facilitating children's participation in environmental decision-making and facilitating their access to effective remedies for violations and abuses of their rights. So I think these heightened obligations are very important once you apply children's rights to different areas of environmental policies. Because, and now I move on to the next slide, because I think it is not enough to spell out the obligations that states have in relation to children's rights and the environment, because this is just a debate among children's rights experts. But in the end, children's rights should be practically applied to different areas of environmental law at the national and international level. Here, for example, I mentioned the SDGs. Children's rights have been written into a number of SDGs, so the Sustainable Development Goals. I hope all of you are familiar with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And what I'm saying here is that children's rights matter in relation to a number of sustainable development goals. But I'm of the opinion that where the environment is concerned, the links are relatively weak. So it makes sense to alert states to the effect, to the importance of considering children's rights when they implement the environment-related targets on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The same applies, for example, to the Climate Paris Agreement, which even explicitly required states to consider children's rights when addressing climate change. So the last four slides that I have included in this presentation are on climate change, because to illustrate this point, because children's rights are often overlooked in international and national policies on climate mitigation and adaptation, for example, related to climate financing, even though children's rights are included in the Paris Agreement. At the same time, and this is here I'm being critical of the children's rights community itself, because at the same time, child protection policies or national action plans on children's rights rarely consider climate change and other environmental issues in depth, including, for example, through education or participation. But, and I repeat myself here, it is important to emphasize that states have obligations to protect children at home and abroad against climate change. And they have to ensure that whatever actions they take, these should not further violate rights, for example, through when they take certain environmental protection measures to combat climate change that might threaten people's livelihoods, including children's livelihoods. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, the body that monitors the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, even urges states to put children's rights at the center of their national climate policies, which is in accordance with the best interests of the child that are included in Article 3 of the Convention. The best interests of the child mean that these interests should be given a primary consideration when states take action that concern children's rights. Finally, to end with, I mention two examples from the national level of Vietnam and the Philippines, where children's best interests or children's rights have in fact been included in climate policy and law. So thank you very much. I hope this has been an interesting talk for you. And I conclude with my final question. And this is whether you think that a child rights approach actually adds value to conventional measures of environmental protection. Because you could say, and I often encounter this reaction when I talk to environmental experts. So, I mean, we already have good environmental protection measures in place. The problem is they are not being applied. But why do you want to apply a child rights approach to environmental protection? What's the added value? And I want to ask you if you think there is an added value, or whether you think that actually human rights or children's rights in particular do not actually contribute to better protection of the environment and humans. Okay, you have not even waited for me to conclude. So I see you all agree with me that the child rights approach has an added value. And I think the added value, one of the most important added values, is because it really makes clear to environmental decision makers the complexity of children's lives. So it's not only about health and development. Of course, it is also about health and development, but it is also about their other rights. For example, their right to culture, identity, the right to play, etc., which are often being overlooked. And it is also about discrimination, because many children or many groups of children are being discriminated against when it comes to the environment, because some live in degraded environments, or some children have to work under bad environmental conditions, etc. So thanks again, and I think we might now move on to a conversation on the issue.